She came home to walk the streets she once called safe, but a racist cop tried to remind her she didn't belong. What he didn't know, she was a Navy SEAL, and what happened next silenced an entire city. The late afternoon sun cast long streaks of gold across the cracked sidewalks of Eastwood, a worn-down neighborhood nestled on the edges of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The golden light filtered through withered trees and danced across the curly hair of a black woman walking steadily down the street. Every step she took was calm, unhurried, but firm, like someone who had nothing left to prove, yet would protect everything if she had to. Her name was Raven James, former Lieutenant Commander of the United States Navy, a real Navy SEAL. It had been 7 years since she left this place, 7 years since she boarded a military transport with nothing but a duffel bag and a clenched jaw after laying her mother to rest. Now she had returned that same old duffel on her back, and the streets felt like memories wrapped in dust. The corner store still had a handwritten 2-for-1 soda sign. The scent of Miss Charlene's fried catfish still wafted from the kitchen that never closed even during hurricanes. And the basketball court still echoed with children's laughter, fierce and free. But something had changed, not the streets, her. Raven wore a plain gray t-shirt that hugged her frame, black cargo pants, and worn-out sneakers, shoes that had marched across deserts and airstrips in countries most people couldn't find on a map. She wasn't in uniform, but her posture betrayed her past. Shoulders back, chin level, eyes steady. Her father once called it command presence. He would have been proud. As she walked past a group of teens huddled outside the corner store, one lanky boy, maybe 16, did a double take. His gaze flicked from her duffel to the way she walked, calm, measured, unshaken. "You in the service or something?" he asked. Raven didn't stop walking, but met his gaze. "Something like that." He grinned. "My uncle's a Marine, walks just like you." Before she could respond, one of his friends called out, and he disappeared inside the store. Raven exhaled slowly, her shoulders loosening. Little moments like that reminded her why she served, why she endured. She'd led men through the blackouts of Khost, the smoke of Mogadishu, the gunfire of Kandahar. And now at 40, she had returned to streets that looked harmless. But danger came in different uniforms here. A low rumble caught her attention. Raven turned slightly, spotting a police cruiser creeping slowly behind her. In Eastwood, police didn't move slow. They sped through windows, up, eyes forward. If they stopped, something was wrong. This stop wasn't normal. Raven kept walking, her gaze ahead, her instincts flaring like heat off pavement. She knew the script. She'd lived it before in uniform. And out. The cruiser rolled closer. The window whirred down with a cold mechanical hiss. A gravelly voice broke the air. "Excuse me, ma'am." She turned slowly. The driver was white, mid-40s, buzz-cut, mirrored sunglasses, and an expression carved from suspicion. His name badge read Officer Troy Becker. He sized her up like a threat, like a puzzle he wasn't sure he liked. "Mind telling me what you're doing around here?" Raven didn't blink. "Walking?" To where she raised a brow. "Didn't realize I needed an itinerary to walk down my own street." His smirk faltered for half a breath. Raven knew that look. She'd seen it in war zones and boardrooms, the look men gave when they didn't know how to handle a woman who wouldn't shrink. "We've had a few break-ins recently," Becker said, tone carefully neutral. "Just making sure everything's in order." Raven met his eyes, unwavering. "Do I look like I'm breaking into anything?" His jaw tensed. "I'm just doing my job. And I'm just walking." The air between them thickened. Becker drummed his fingers on the steering wheel once, twice before shifting the car into park. "Let's see some ID." Raven didn't move. Her SEAL training clicked in. His thumb was near his holster, not gripping, but close enough to make a statement. From the corners of her vision, she noticed people pausing. Conversations stopped. Eyes turned. She slowly reached into her pocket, calm, precise, and pulled out her military ID. She didn't hand it over. She just held it where he could see. Becker squinted. "Military, huh?" She said nothing. He extended his hand. "Let me see that. You can read it from there." But this wasn't a request. It was a test. Becker snatched the card from her hand without warning, flipping it in his fingers like he was trying to expose a lie. "Navy SEAL," he read aloud, his lips curling. "That's cute. Return it," Raven said, her voice flat but firm. Becker tilted his head. "I've patrolled these streets for 20 years. Never seen a female SEAL. You sure this isn't fake?" You can run it through your system, she replied unbothered. It'll check out. But she knew he didn't want confirmation. He wanted her to crack. From across the street, a young woman pulled out her phone and started recording. She didn't bother hiding it. She wanted Becker to see. And he did. His stance changed. You got a problem, he barked at the woman. She said nothing, just kept filming. Raven almost smiled. Power shifted when someone was watching. If you don't want a show, Raven said dryly, stop performing. Becker stepped out of the car, closing the space between them. Just a few inches, but deliberate. I don't know who you think you are, he hissed. You sure you want to find out? Robin answered, calm as ever. Then just as she expected, his hand reached toward her wrist. A mistake. The moment Officer Becker's fingers brushed her wrist, Raven moved not with panic, not with violence, but with precision. A soft pivot, a quiet redirection. Before his grip could form, her body had shifted, slipping just enough for his hand to catch empty air. The movement was so smooth, so controlled, it barely registered as a reaction, more like the breeze changing direction. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like Becker stumbled forward on his own. Raven remained still, hands lowered, gaze steady, but every nerve in her body was locked in readiness, her muscles coiled like steel springs. That's assault, Becker snapped too loud, hoping the word alone would restore control. No, Raven replied, her tone like steel wrapped in silk. That's avoiding unnecessary contact. You think this is funny? He growled. She tilted her head slightly. Do I look like I'm laughing? His hand darted to his radio. Dispatch, I need backup. Uncooperative suspect, potential threat. From behind, someone scoffed loudly. Uncooperative? She's the only calm one here. The young woman filming took a step forward. You're the one escalating. But Becker didn't turn. Couldn't. He was too deep in it now, too far gone to back down. Becker's eyes flared with something darker now. Not authority, but embarrassment. And for men like him, shame was the most dangerous trigger. He stepped closer, puffing up his chest like a cornered animal. Turn around, he barked. Hands behind your back. Raven didn't flinch. She inhaled slowly, gathering the energy in the air around her. Years of training in chaos had taught her to listen not just to words, but to moments. This moment, it was spiraling. Officer Becker said quietly but firmly, you're making a mistake. No! He snapped, his voice thin with fury. You made the mistake, thinking you could walk away from me. He lunged, hand reaching for his cuffs, body charging forward. And that was when Raven moved. Not like a civilian reacting in fear, but like a warrior anticipating every angle of attack. She sidestepped, rotated, and redirected his momentum with the ease of someone who had neutralized real threats in real war zones. Becker stumbled off balance, caught in the momentum of his own arrogance. She hadn't touched him, and yet in the eyes of the crowd, he had just lost. Becker caught himself on the hood of his cruiser, gasping. The silence that followed wasn't quiet, it was charged. Crackling. Witnessed. Then, oh, damn, someone whispered. She flipped him without even laying a hand. Phones went up higher. Fingers tapped record. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It was something else, something uncontainable. Raven stood motionless. You're losing control of the situation, she said, calm but direct. Turn around, Becker yelled again. Now. For what? Raven asked. He didn't answer. A man from the crowd shouted, we all saw it. She didn't even touch you, man. Becker's jaw tightened. His nostrils flared. And then he snapped. He lunged again, pride overriding reason. But this time Raven caught his wrist midair, twisted not with force but with finesse, and turned him, locking his arm behind him in a position that left him helpless, but unharmed. Gasps erupted, phones zoomed in, and in less than 5 seconds the power dynamic flipped. A man once feared in uniform was now frozen breath short, trapped by the very calm he'd tried to dismantle. She released him, letting him stumble forward, arms flailing for balance. And the crowd, they saw everything. Becker stood there, cheeks burning, chest heaving, outmatched in every possible way. Raven didn't move. She didn't need to. Are we done here? She asked, her voice smooth, precise. He didn't answer. A second police cruiser pulled up. Lights, dim engine purring low. Out stepped a man older, steadier, Sergeant Nathan Graves. His eyes scanned the scene. Raven's composure, Becker's disheveled stance. The crowd silent but filming. What the hell's going on here? Graves demanded. Becker tried to speak. She resisted, got aggressive. That's a lie, the woman filming snapped before anyone else could. Graves turned to Raven. Is that true? Raven shook her head once. No, sir. He stopped me without cause. I cooperated. He escalated. Graves's gaze flicked down to Becker's hand, still clutching Raven's military ID. He took it, read the name aloud. Lieutenant Commander Raven James, he said slowly. The murmurs began in the crowd. Graves's face changed. Respect replaced scrutiny. He turned to Becker. You knew she was military. Becker opened his mouth but had no words, and that silence was louder than any excuse he could have made. Does anyone here have footage of this? Sergeant Graves asked. Instantly, more than 10 hands went up. The woman with the phone stepped forward. I've got everything, from the moment he stopped her to the moment she flipped him without breaking a sweat. Becker's breath hitched. Graves didn't hesitate. Officer Becker, you're relieved of duty. Effective immediately. Gasps swept through the crowd. Becker turned pale. You can't be serious, he muttered. I suggest you stop talking before you make this worse, Graves said sharply. The damage is already done. He turned back to Raven, his tone shifting. Lieutenant James, do you wish to press charges? Raven let the silence stretch long enough to let every camera, every eye, and every ounce of tension settle. Then softly she shook her head. No, she said. I didn't come here to fight. I came here to walk. A ripple passed through the crowd, quiet, reverent. Becker stared at her stunned. Why not press charges, he asked, voice cracking. She looked at him, not with malice, not with pity, just clarity. Because I already taught you the lesson you needed to learn. And with that, she walked away. Raven stood still, facing Sergeant Graves. The tension in the crowd hadn't lifted. It had merely shifted. Now every gaze was on her, not out of suspicion, but out of respect. They waited for her decision as though the entire block held its breath. She could press charges. She had the proof, the witnesses, the moral ground. But instead, Raven shook her head. No, she said, her voice low but unwavering. I didn't come back here looking for a fight. I just wanted to walk down the street I grew up on, without being treated like a threat. The crowd murmured, a few nodding, others blinking back emotion. Officer Becker didn't say a word. His fists clenched at his sides, jaw locked tight. He wasn't just defeated, he was stripped. And not by force, but by something far more powerful, composure. Raven wasn't angry anymore. What she felt now was heavier exhaustion. The kind that came from having to prove your worth, your identity, your right to exist, over and over again. Sergeant Graves watched her for a long moment, then finally nodded. You made your point, Lieutenant, he said quietly. And everyone knew she didn't need a courtroom to win. Graves turned to the crowd. All right, folks, show's over. We appreciate your cooperation. Please submit any footage to the department for the internal investigation. Most began to disperse, though a few lingered, watching Raven with something deeper than curiosity. It was admiration. A young woman, maybe in her late 20s, still holding her phone, walked over. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. You made me proud today, she said. I'm a single mom. I worry every day about whether I can protect my daughter from moments like this. But what you did gave me hope. Raven gave her a soft smile and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Hope doesn't come from what we avoid, she said, but from what we're willing to confront. Becker had retreated back to his cruiser. He sat inside, staring forward, face flushed with something far worse than rage, humiliation. Phones were still recording, still watching. But now the gaze wasn't on Raven. It was on him. And this time he had no badge, no authority, no crowd control to hide behind. Raven didn't need a weapon. She had something stronger, dignity. Night had settled over Baton Rouge. Raven walked slowly down the cracked sidewalk of her childhood street. The stars barely shimmered through the haze of city lights, and the air was thick with summer. She stopped at her father's old house. The porch light still worked. The wooden steps still creaked. The door still moaned the same way it had when she snuck in past curfew years ago. But tonight, everything felt heavier. She sat on the top step, placed her duffel bag beside her, and traced the faded grain of the wood with her fingers. This place had once meant safety. Now it was just quiet. The screen door creaked behind her. You always sit like that when your mind's loud, came a familiar voice. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. Uncle Leonard, He stepped outside and eased down beside her, placing 2 bottles of iced tea between them. No words at first, just the rhythm of shared silence. "I thought I came back here to find peace," Raven said quietly. "But I'm starting to think maybe peace doesn't live here anymore." Uncle Leonard cracked open his bottle and smiled gently. "Peace doesn't come from where you stand. It comes from how you stand. You think it changed anything?" Raven asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Uncle Leonard didn't answer right away. He looked out over the yard where the grass grew wild and stubborn, just like her. He tapped the bottle lightly against his knee. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. She turned to him. "The question ain't whether you changed everything. It's whether you changed something." Raven sat with that, and in the quiet it settled deep. Maybe a kid saw her that day and learned that you don't have to shrink when someone flashes power in your face. Maybe a young cop realized that a badge isn't a shield from accountability. Maybe even Becker, if there was a shred of decency left, would stare into the mirror a little longer tonight. Not everything changes at once, but something might have started. That crowd, Leonard said, they won't forget what they saw. Neither would she. She thought of the boy who asked if she was military, the woman filming, the child watching from behind his mother's leg. No, she hadn't flipped a system, but she had flipped the moment, and sometimes that's where change begins. "So what now?" Leonard asked. Raven set down the bottle, stood up slowly, and adjusted the strap of her duffel bag. "I keep walking," she said, "like my father taught me. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but because if we stop walking, the wrong things start moving forward." Leonard grinned. "Your daddy would be proud." Raven smiled faintly, her eyes soft with memory. She stepped off the porch, shoulders, square posture firm, not like someone retreating, but like someone moving towards something new. Behind her, the house stood still. Ahead of her, the street lay quiet and uncertain, but her steps were steady. The fight she faced wasn't over, not by a long shot. But it wouldn't be fought with fists or fury. It would be fought by showing up, by standing firm, by reminding people with every stride that dignity doesn't ask for permission. And courage, sometimes it's as simple as refusing to step aside. While Raven walked through the quiet streets of her old neighborhood not far away, the Baton Rouge Police Department sat under a different kind of tension. Sergeant Nathan Graves sat behind his desk, hands folded in front of him, replaying the footage sent by more than a dozen citizens. He didn't need to watch every second he'd been there, but he did. Not to verify, but to remind himself truth doesn't need commentary. It just needs a witness. The screen froze on the moment Raven stepped away from Becker, unharmed, unshaken, unwavering. Graves leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. He'd known Becker had issues, but he had ignored them, passed them off as rough edges. Now it was on record, and the city was watching. A young officer knocked on the door. "Sir, Becker's requested immediate leave." Graves nodded slowly. "Good," he said. He should also start thinking about what life looks like when your authority isn't tied to a badge. Graves knew this wasn't about one incident. It was about a pattern, one that had finally been exposed. And it took a woman like Raven to make them all stop pretending. Becker sat in his car alone, tucked behind the station in the farthest corner of the lot. The engine hummed quietly, but the air inside felt cold. His hands trembled slightly. In one of them was Raven's ID, still in his possession, even though he had no right to hold it anymore. Her name stared back at him in bold lettering. Lieutenant Commander, Navy SEAL. He scoffed. At first, then swallowed hard. The title mocked him now, not because of what it said, but because of what it reminded him he could never be. The phone on the passenger seat pinged. The video was going viral. The thumbnail, him stumbling, her calm as a glacier. The caption, "Rokoab tries to arrest Black Navy SEAL gets embarrassed in front of entire block." His fingers hovered above the screen, but he didn't press play. He didn't need to. He knew what the world saw now. Not a protector, not a soldier of the law, but a man undone by a woman's silence. And the worst part, he had done it to himself. By the next morning, the headlines wrote themselves. Black female veteran stands her ground, community rallies behind her. Police confront Navy SEAL and hometown standoff footage goes viral. No spin, no ambiguity. It was clear who the aggressor was, and even clearer who the crowd supported. Coffee shops buzzed, neighborhoods whispered. Schools showed clips in government class. Everyone had an opinion, but few could deny one thing: Raven James had handled herself with more grace under pressure than most could ever dream of. In one quiet corner cafe, two older men sat at a table reading the paper. "Back in my day," one muttered, "a woman like her wouldn't get to wear that uniform." His friend lowered his mug. "Yeah, back in your day, men like Becker didn't get called out either. There was no applause, no parade, but there was presence." Raven's name became a quiet ripple through the city, not a protest, not a riot, just a woman who walked and made an entire city sit up straighter. That afternoon, Raven sat alone on a bench in the city park beneath a canopy of oaks. The world around her kept moving. Children laughing, dogs barking, joggers passing. But inside her, a stillness remained. Her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize. "Hi, I'm a police cadet in training. I saw the footage. Just wanted to say thank you. I want to be more like Sergeant Graves, not Officer Becker." Raven stared at the screen, unmoving, then typed, "Integrity doesn't come from the badge. It comes from the spine behind it. Lead with both." She hit send and let the phone fall into her lap. The kid from the street, the woman filming, even some of the officers watching all of them, had witnessed something that day. Not a fight, not a takedown, but a quiet refusal to be erased. Raven hadn't changed the system. Not yet. But she had created a moment that couldn't be ignored. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. That night, Raven stood on the front porch of her father's house for the last time. The light buzzed above her, flickering, slightly, same as it had when she was a child. Uncle Leonard stepped outside, holding a folded piece of paper. "Something came in the mail for you," he said, handing it over. "From the department, invitation to consult on officer training." "Voluntary, of course." Raven raised an eyebrow. "Me training cops." Leonard chuckled. "Well, who better to teach them how to stand down without losing themselves?" She didn't answer right away. But she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her bag. In the morning she would leave, not because she was running from something, but because she was walking towards something new. The fight would continue, she knew that, but she would no longer fight it on someone else's terms. With each step, she'd carry the weight of those who came before her and make space for those who would follow. Because sometimes change doesn't start with sirens or speeches. Sometimes it starts with one person who refuses to sit down. The next morning, Raven sat alone at the Baton Rouge train station. Her duffel bag rested beside her, scuffed from time and battles it could never fully explain. She wasn't in uniform, didn't need to be. Everything about her posture, silence, presence told a story. The platform was quiet except for the rustling breeze and the distant rumble of an approaching train. She closed her eyes, not from fatigue, but from reflection. A young man in a police cadet uniform approached her hesitantly. His name tag read Lewis. "Lieutenant James," he asked. She turned slowly. "I just wanted to thank you," he said. "The video of you, it made me rethink why I joined. I want to protect people, not control them." Raven didn't speak right away, but then she gave a small nod. "Then protect them with your presence, not your power." When the train finally arrived, she stood, slung her bag over her shoulder, and stepped on board. She didn't look back, not because she was leaving something behind, but because she knew something had been left in her place. A ripple, a reckoning, a reason to hope. Back at the station, Sergeant Nathan Graves sat alone, staring at a blank training whiteboard. The silence inside his office was different now. He picked up a folder marked with Raven's name and placed it beside a new one: Field Reform Program, Community Leadership Candidates. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A young officer peeked in. "Sir, is the SEAL lady really not pressing charges?" "No," Graves said without looking up. She already made her point. She didn't need a courtroom. "Think it'll change anything?" Graves finally looked up. "If you're asking that, it already has. Outside cadets lined up for a new training seminar, mandatory now. Not on how to draw a weapon, but on how to de-escalate without destruction." Raven's name wasn't mentioned. Her story didn't have to be told. It was already being lived by the recruits who had watched a woman walk into a trap and walk out with her dignity untouched. She didn't need to stay to make change. She had become the standard others would be measured against. And standards don't fade, they multiply. 3 days later, Officer Troy Becker sat alone in a corner diner on the outskirts of town. No badge, no patrol car, Just a man and his bruised ego replaying a moment that wouldn't stop burning. The waitress barely looked at him. A child at the next table pointed. "Mom, isn't that the guy?" The soldier flipped. The mother shushed him gently and guided the child's gaze elsewhere. Becker sat straighter in his seat, face flushed. He wasn't angry at them. He was angry at himself. For not listening. For letting power mask insecurity. For mistaking silence as weakness. He pulled out Raven's military ID, returned to him by Internal Affairs for documentation, and stared at her photo. There was no smirk in her picture. No smugness. Just stillness. And behind that stillness, strength he hadn't seen. Or hadn't wanted to. He whispered to no one in particular, "I wasn't supposed to be that guy." But he was. And that was the truth no apology could erase. No parades were thrown, no medals pinned. But in the days that followed, Raven's presence lingered across Baton Rouge. A mural appeared on the side of a barbershop wall, her silhouette standing tall beneath a swirl of city buildings and storm clouds. No name, just the words, "Stand your ground." With grace. At a local high school, a civics teacher played the video in class. "Watch her posture," he told his students. "Watch how she refuses to fold. That's what real strength looks like." At the police academy, cadets now trained with a new rule before any interaction they had to recite aloud, "Power is borrowed. Respect is earned." It was never attributed to Raven, but they knew who it came from. In the quiet corners of the city, people nodded when they passed the mural. Parents told their kids her story at dinner. And for once, a story about a black veteran in the police didn't end in tragedy. It ended in transformation. Raven had walked away, but her shadow stayed behind. Not dark, but guiding. From the window of her train, Raven stared out at the blur of passing fields and rust-red rooftops. The world looked the same, but she knew something had shifted. She wasn't a headline. She wasn't a hero. She was simply a woman who refused to shrink in a moment that demanded she disappear. And because of that, something had cracked. Not the system, not yet, but the silence that held it together. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "You don't have to shout to change the world. Just make sure when you stand, they feel it." She opened her eyes. There were more cities ahead, more moments like the ones she just faced, more people like Officer Becker who would test her calm, more children watching, waiting to see if someone would rise. And when that time came again, Raven knew she wouldn't need to prepare. Because once you've stood your ground with grace, you never forget how. Real strength isn't loud. It doesn't need to raise its voice or swing its fists. It shows up. It stands still. It refuses to shrink when challenged. Raven James didn't fight back with anger. She responded with restraint, presence, and power rooted in truth. And because of that, she changed something that day. Not the whole world, but enough of it to matter. Sometimes the quietest resistance leaves the loudest legacy.